Vanessa Carter boarded the plane that night with a sense of purpose, determined to uncover the legacy of her grandmother, a woman whose courage had shaped the civil rights movement. But what was supposed to be a quiet flight to Seattle turned into something far more shocking. Unjustly singled out by the captain and removed from the flight, Vanessa found herself stranded in a desolate, forgotten corner of the country. What began as a moment of isolation became the start of an extraordinary journey. Taken in by a small, struggling community, Vanessa discovered a world of untold stories, relentless resilience, and the power of unexpected kindness. As she fought to bring light to their struggles, she found herself confronting powerful adversaries, challenging her own doubts, and stepping into a role she never expected to play. Would the world listen to her fight for justice? Could one small voice ignite a movement of change? Vanessa Carter sat by the window in the dimly lit cabin of the plane, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. The hum of the engines was steady, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to echo the nervous energy coursing through her. Outside the small, oval window, the sprawling runway was a sea of darkness interrupted by pools of light from scattered floodlights. The air inside the cabin carried the faint smell of coffee, mixed with the sterile tang of recycled air. Vanessa had taken this flight countless times before, always for work. Her job as a nurse at a busy downtown hospital in Chicago demanded these trips for conferences and training. This flight, however, was different. It wasn't about work. It wasn't even about her. It was about uncovering a truth. She had only recently learned a truth that had upended everything she thought she knew about herself. A letter had arrived in her mailbox a few weeks ago, written on faded stationery in a neat, looping script. It was from a distant relative on her mother's side, someone she had never met. The letter revealed a startling connection. Vanessa was the granddaughter of Eleanor Carter, a pivotal but little-known leader in the civil rights movement. She had never been told about this part of her family's history. Her mother, a private and pragmatic woman, had shielded Vanessa from the weight of their legacy. The revelation had left her reeling. How could she not have known? How could she have walked through life unaware of the shoulders she stood upon? Her curiosity had grown into determination, and now she was on her way to Seattle to visit the archives where Eleanor's personal papers were stored. The trip felt monumental, as if she was finally stepping into a part of herself she had never known was missing. Vanessa looked around the cabin. The passengers were a mix of weary professionals, casual tourists, and the occasional family with restless children. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a cream cardigan over a soft blue blouse, paired with simple slacks. She looked composed, approachable, but inside a storm brewed. Memories of her childhood flashed through her mind. Her upbringing had been stable, but lonely. Her mother worked long hours to provide for them after her father left when she was 7. Vanessa had spent many evenings sitting by the window, reading books and watching the world go by. Despite the solitude, her mother's sacrifices instilled in her a deep sense of responsibility and resilience. The intercom crackled, breaking her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are preparing for departure. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The engines roared, and Vanessa felt the familiar push against her seat as the plane began to taxi down the runway. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Vanessa felt a momentary sense of freedom. The city lights below grew smaller, fading into a tapestry of pinpricks. For the first time in weeks, the constant pressure of her thoughts began to ease. She allowed herself to think of her grandmother, imagining what kind of woman Eleanor Carter must have been. Strong, determined, and unyielding in the face of unimaginable odds. A flight attendant approached her row, interrupting her musings. The young woman offered a polite smile, but seemed slightly nervous. "Good evening, ma'am. Would you like a drink?" "Just water, please," Vanessa replied with a warm smile. She noticed the slight tremor in the attendant's hand as she placed the glass on Vanessa's tray. It wasn't unusual. People often seemed unsure around Vanessa, mistaking her quiet demeanor for sternness. Vanessa sipped her water and looked out the window again, but her focus was broken when she noticed 2 passengers across the aisle whispering. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit leaned toward his companion, glancing at Vanessa with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She caught fragments of their conversation. Looks familiar. Who do you think she is? No idea. But why is she here? Vanessa had grown used to these reactions. It wasn't the first time she felt like she didn't belong, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Yet, she reminded herself that her presence was valid, her journey necessary. The plane leveled out, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating a hushed atmosphere. Vanessa leaned back and closed her eyes, hoping for a moment of peace. But peace was elusive. A subtle tension hung in the air, one she couldn't quite place. She noticed the captain exiting the cockpit and scanning the cabin. His gaze lingered on her longer than seemed necessary. He adjusted his hat and walked away, but the unease he left in his wake stayed with her. Vanessa thought back to the letter. She hadn't shared its contents with anyone, not even her closest friends. This journey wasn't just about discovering her roots. It was about understanding herself. Who was she now, knowing the weight of her family's history? Could she live up to the expectations that came with it? The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began shifting in their seats. Some retrieved laptops or books, while others stretched and chatted quietly. Vanessa pulled a journal from her bag, flipping through its pages filled with notes and questions she had prepared for her trip. What were Eleanor's greatest challenges? What kept her going? What would she think of me? The last question lingered painfully. Vanessa had always struggled with self-doubt, often feeling like she wasn't enough despite her achievements. Becoming a nurse had been her way of giving back, of finding purpose in the chaos of life. Yet, there was always a nagging feeling that she could do more, be more. As she wrote, the plane shuddered slightly, a bump of turbulence that jolted her from her thoughts. Her pen skidded across the page, leaving a faint line. She closed the journal and tucked it back in her bag, her gaze wandering to the window once more. Outside, the darkness was unbroken, save for the occasional flash of a distant light. Vanessa's reflection stared back at her, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself feel proud of the woman she saw. She was on a journey, one of discovery, growth, and resilience. She didn't know what awaited her in Seattle, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face it. As the cabin settled into quiet murmurs and the hum of the engines, Vanessa felt a small but steady ember of hope ignite within her. This was only the beginning. Vanessa Carter's fingers traced the edge of her journal, her thoughts flickering between the past and the present. The faint vibrations of the plane felt grounding, a small tether to reality amidst the whirlwind of emotions her journey had stirred. She tucked the journal into the seat pocket in front of her and leaned back, her eyes scanning the cabin. Most of the passengers seemed engrossed in their own worlds, reading, watching movies, or nodding off under the dim glow of overhead lights. Yet, here and there, Vanessa caught fleeting glances directed her way. She told herself it was nothing. People were often curious about her quiet confidence or the air of purpose she carried, though sometimes that curiosity came tinged with judgment. Her attention shifted when she saw movement at the front of the cabin. The captain had emerged from the cockpit again. Vanessa watched as he exchanged low, hurried words with one of the flight attendants near the galley. His expression, stern and unreadable, gave her pause. He scanned the cabin again, and for a brief moment, his gaze locked with hers. The look was fleeting but sharp enough to send a jolt through Vanessa. She tried to dismiss it. Perhaps he was checking on a routine matter, or maybe she was imagining things. But the unsettling feeling that had crept in her chest during their earlier interaction began to grow. She took a sip of water, letting the coolness soothe her. Her thoughts wandered back to her grandmother's letter, the words etched in her mind. Our family has always stood for something greater than ourselves. I see that same spark in you. Vanessa wondered if Eleanor Carter had ever felt the weight of being watched, judged, or underestimated, simply because of who she was. The flight attendant from earlier approached Vanessa's row again, her polite smile faltering as she leaned closer. "Miss Carter, may I have a word?" Vanessa straightened in her seat. "Of course," she said, keeping her tone even. "Could you follow me to the front, please?" the flight attendant asked, her voice soft but edged with tension. Vanessa hesitated, glancing around the cabin. A few passengers exchanged curious looks, whispering behind cupped hands. She met the flight attendant's gaze and nodded, rising from her seat. As she followed the attendant toward the galley, Vanessa's mind raced. What was this about? Had she done something wrong? She quickly dismissed the thought. Her ticket was valid, her paperwork in order. There was no reason for concern, at least, none that she could think of. The galley was a narrow, brightly lit space lined with metal cabinets and carts. The captain stood waiting, his arms crossed. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of authority that seemed to border on arrogance. "Miss Carter," he said curtly, his voice low but firm. "I'm Captain Morris. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Vanessa felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "What's this about, Captain?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze flicking to the flight attendant, who stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "We've had reports of irregularities regarding your presence on this flight." "Irregularities?" Vanessa repeated, her voice steady despite the simmering unease. "My ticket is valid, and I passed through every security checkpoint like everyone else." "What kind of irregularities are you referring to?" The captain shifted his weight, his posture rigid. "I'm responsible for the safety of this flight, and it's my job to ensure everything is in order. Your presence raises some questions, and I need to verify your identity." Vanessa felt the sting of his words, the unspoken implications hanging heavy in the air. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. "I am a registered passenger on this flight, Captain. If there's a specific issue, I'd like to know what it is." Captain Morris's gaze hardened, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he said, "We'll be making an unscheduled stop shortly. At that point, I'll need you to disembark." Vanessa's stomach tightened. "Are you serious?" His tone didn't waver. "I am. You'll be escorted off the plane once we land." The flight attendant looked as though she wanted to intervene, but said nothing. Vanessa turned to her, searching for some sign of explanation or reassurance, but the woman avoided her gaze. Anger bubbled beneath Vanessa's calm exterior. This wasn't about protocol or safety. She could feel it in the captain's demeanor, in the way his words dripped with veiled hostility. But rather than lash out, she reminded herself of her grandmother's wisdom. Stand firm, but never lose your dignity. "This is unacceptable," Vanessa said, her voice sharp but controlled. "I've done nothing to warrant this treatment. You'll be hearing from me and from my lawyer." Captain Morris's lips thinned, but he said nothing more. Vanessa returned to her seat, her mind reeling. The whispers in the cabin grew louder as passengers speculated about what had just occurred. Vanessa could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental. She held her head high, refusing to let the scrutiny break her. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be making an unscheduled landing due to operational requirements. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Vanessa gripped the armrests as the plane began its descent. Her mind raced through her options. She could make a scene, demand answers, and refuse to leave. But that would only escalate the situation and paint her as the aggressor. Instead, she resolved to comply for now, knowing she would fight back in due course. As the plane touched down on a dimly lit runway, Vanessa's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let this injustice stand. Whatever the captain's motives, he had underestimated her. When the cabin door opened and a blast of cold night air rushed in, Vanessa stood and gathered her belongings. As she stepped off the plane, she felt the weight of the passengers' stares on her back, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and silent complicity. The captain's voice echoed behind her. "Good luck, Miss Carter." Vanessa didn't look back. She descended the stairs onto the cracked asphalt of the runway, her breath visible in the frigid air. The plane's engines roared as it prepared to leave, its lights fading into the distance. Standing alone on the desolate tarmac, Vanessa felt the sting of isolation, but also the fire of determination. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. Vanessa Carter stood on the cracked asphalt of the desolate tarmac, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid night air. The harsh floodlights overhead cast long shadows across the ground, highlighting the barren emptiness around her. In the distance, the plane that had left her behind disappeared into the darkness, its red and white lights blinking faintly against the horizon. For a moment, Vanessa allowed herself to feel the weight of the situation. Alone, unjustly removed from a flight, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Her chest tightened, but she steadied herself, recalling her grandmother's words. Even when you're alone, you're never truly powerless. Stand tall, even in the face of injustice. Vanessa glanced around, searching for signs of life. The airport was barely functional, a small regional outpost with a few dimly lit buildings in the distance. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, but the tarmac itself was eerily quiet. She adjusted her coat against the cold and started walking toward the lights, each step crunching against the gritty pavement. As she approached the chain-link fence that bordered the airfield, she spotted movement beyond the gate. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their voices carried faintly on the wind. Vanessa's footsteps slowed as she studied them, a woman and 2 men, dressed in worn but practical clothing. The woman, tall and thin with gray-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, stopped first. She held up a hand, signaling the others. "Who's there?" her voice called, sharp and cautious. Vanessa raised her hands slightly, palms out in a gesture of peace. "My name is Vanessa Carter," she said, her voice clear but steady. "I was just removed from a flight and left here. I need some help." The 3 strangers exchanged wary glances. The taller of the 2 men, stocky with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward. "Left here," he repeated, incredulous. The younger man, barely in his 20s with wild curls under a knit cap, shook his head. "Who just leaves someone here? That's messed up." The woman narrowed her eyes, studying Vanessa's face. Then, as if deciding, she pushed the gate open. "Come on," she said. "We're not leaving anyone out here tonight." Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward. "Thank you," she said sincerely. As she passed through the gate, the older woman introduced herself. "I'm Deborah, and these are Marcus and Carlos." She gestured to the bearded man and the younger one. "We live about a mile from here. Not much, but it's better than standing out in the cold." Vanessa nodded gratefully. "I appreciate it. I'll find a way to repay your kindness." Deborah waved her hand dismissively. "No need for all that. Just keep up, we got a bit of a walk." The group began their trek down a narrow, gravel-strewn path. Vanessa could hear the crunch of their boots mingling with the faint rustle of the wind. The silence was broken only by the occasional murmur of conversation between Marcus and Carlos, their voices low but warm. Deborah glanced at Vanessa as they walked. "So, what's your story? Why'd they leave you here?" Vanessa hesitated. It wasn't a story easily summarized. "It's complicated," she said finally. "The captain claimed there were irregularities with my presence, but I think we both know what that really means." Deborah gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I know exactly what that means. People like us irregular just for existing." Vanessa nodded, grateful for the unspoken understanding. As they walked, she began to feel a strange sense of calm. Despite the injustice she'd faced, she wasn't alone anymore. The path led to a small settlement tucked into the edge of a wooded area. It was a cluster of modest homes, their walls patched and weathered but standing strong. Warm light spilled from windows, illuminating the muddy paths between them. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, carrying the faint scent of wood burning. "This is home," Deborah said simply, gesturing to the settlement. Vanessa followed them to a modest house near the center of the community. Inside, the space was small but inviting, with mismatched furniture and a wood-burning stove that cast a cozy glow. Deborah motioned for Vanessa to sit on a worn couch, and Marcus disappeared into the kitchen. "You hungry?" Deborah asked. "Marcus is making some tea. We've got bread and soup if you need it." Vanessa nodded. "That sounds wonderful. Thank you." As she settled in, Deborah sat across from her, her sharp eyes never leaving Vanessa's face. "I can tell you're not used to being in a place like this," she said. Vanessa smiled faintly. "I'm not. I grew up in the city of Chicago, but my grandmother was from the South. She fought for a lot of the rights we have today. I guess you could say I'm trying to understand her better." Deborah's expression softened. "Your grandmother sounds like a strong woman. That kind of strength doesn't just vanish, you know. It's in you, too." Vanessa's chest tightened at the words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them. Marcus returned with a tray of mugs and a plate of bread. Carlos followed, carrying a pot of steaming soup. As the group settled around the small table, Vanessa listened to their stories. Deborah had lived in the settlement for decades, watching it rise and fall under the weight of neglect from those in power. Marcus had returned after years in the city, hoping to help rebuild what was left. Carlos, the youngest, had grown up here, dreaming of a life beyond its borders but feeling the pull of home. As the evening wore on, Vanessa felt a growing sense of connection. These were people who understood struggle, resilience, and the quiet strength it took to keep moving forward. When the conversation lulled, Deborah looked at Vanessa thoughtfully. You said you're on a journey to understand your grandmother. Maybe what you're really doing is finding yourself. Vanessa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the words settle, feeling their truth resonate deep within her. That night, as she lay on a cot in a small guest room, Vanessa stared at the cracked ceiling above her. The weight of the day pressed down on her, but so did something new, something lighter. Kindness. It had come unexpectedly from people who owed her nothing. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. Tomorrow, she would figure out her next steps. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel gratitude and hope. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains of the guest room, casting pale stripes across the modest wooden floor. Vanessa Carter sat up slowly, stretching to shake off the lingering chill of the night. The air smelled of smoke from the wood-burning stove and freshly brewed coffee, a comforting mix that reminded her she was far from the sterile, bustling city she called home. As she dressed, Vanessa thought about the kindness Deborah, Marcus, and Carlos had shown her. They didn't ask questions that probed too deeply or demand explanations for her situation. Instead, they offered shelter and food, giving her a chance to regroup. She was grateful, but the injustice of her removal from the flight still simmered beneath the surface. Vanessa stepped into the main living area, where the warmth from the stove was more pronounced. Deborah was sitting at the table, cradling a mug of coffee. She glanced up and nodded toward another cup already poured. "Morning," Deborah said. "Good morning," Vanessa replied, taking the seat across from her. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, savoring the quiet moment. Marcus and Carlos were outside, their voices faint but lively as they worked on repairing a section of the fence surrounding the settlement. Vanessa could hear the rhythmic clink of tools against metal. She looked at Deborah, whose sharp eyes seemed to take in everything without missing a beat. "Thank you for everything," Vanessa said. "I wasn't sure what I was going to do last night." Deborah waved a dismissive hand. "We've all been there. No one gets through life without needing a little help now and then." Vanessa hesitated, then asked, "How did this place come to be? It feels forgotten." Deborah's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered her answer. "That's because it is forgotten by most folks anyway. This settlement's been here for decades. People came looking for work when the mill opened. When it closed, the ones who couldn't leave stayed. Now we're holding on, trying to keep what little we have." Vanessa nodded, a pang of familiarity settling in her chest. The story wasn't unlike those she had heard as a nurse. Struggling neighborhoods, forgotten communities, places that thrived despite the odds, thanks to the grit and determination of the people living there. The door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Fence is holding for now," he said, "but we'll need stronger posts soon." "Morning, Vanessa." "Good morning," she replied, offering a small smile. Carlos followed, his youthful energy a sharp contrast to Marcus's steady demeanor. "Hey, Vanessa," he said brightly, grabbing a piece of bread from the table. Deborah shot him a look, but her scolding tone was mild. "Carlos manners." He shrugged sheepishly. "Sorry. Hope you slept okay." "I did, thank you," Vanessa said, genuinely touched by their concern. Marcus leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "So, what's next for you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than Vanessa expected. She hadn't thought much beyond making it to Seattle and digging into her grandmother's legacy. But now, after what had happened on the plane, the path forward seemed less clear. "I need to get to Seattle," she said finally. That's where I was headed before everything. Deborah raised an eyebrow. Seattle's a way off. You got people waiting for you there. Vanessa hesitated. Not exactly. I was going to research my grandmother's work. She was involved in the civil rights movement. The room grew quiet, the weight of her words settling over them. Finally, Deborah spoke, her voice softer than before. Sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Vanessa said. At least from what I've been able to learn. I didn't know about her work until recently. My mother, she kept it from me. I think she wanted to protect me from the weight of it all. Deborah nodded slowly. Sometimes we carry the past without realizing it's part of us. Sounds like you're figuring out where you fit in all that. Vanessa took a deep breath. I just want to understand who she was and maybe who I'm supposed to be. Carlos, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally chimed in. Well, I think that's pretty cool. Most people don't care about history, but it sounds like yours is worth knowing. Vanessa smiled at his sincerity. Thank you. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Marcus invited Vanessa to help with the fence repairs, and though she wasn't particularly handy, she found the physical work grounding. The sun climbed higher, warming the air just enough to make the labor less biting. As they worked, Vanessa learned more about the settlement. Marcus spoke of the challenges they faced: predatory corporations trying to buy their land, corrupt officials ignoring their needs, and the ever-present threat of losing what little they had built. It's like we're invisible, Marcus said, driving a post into the ground. No one cares what happens out here unless they think they can make a profit off it. Vanessa felt a familiar pang of frustration. She had seen the same disregard in the neighborhoods she served as a nurse. People left to fend for themselves, their voices drowned out by those with power. By midday, the fence was secure, and the group gathered for lunch. Deborah brought out bowls of hearty stew, and the four of them sat on the porch, their conversation lighter now. Vanessa found herself laughing at Carlos's jokes, feeling a sense of ease she hadn't expected. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the settlement, Vanessa realized something had shifted within her. The kindness she had been shown, the stories she had heard, the resilience she had witnessed, all of it reminded her of why she had embarked on this journey in the first place. Her grandmother's fight wasn't just about civil rights. It was about humanity, about standing up for the dignity and worth of every person. Vanessa saw echoes of that fight here, in the determination of Deborah, Marcus, and Carlos to protect their community. That evening, as the stars emerged in the clear night sky, Vanessa sat with Deborah by the fire. "You've got something special here," Vanessa said, her voice thoughtful. Deborah nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "We fight every day to keep it that way." Vanessa looked into the fire, her resolve hardening. "Maybe it's time more people saw what you're fighting for." Deborah turned to her, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "And how do you plan to do that?" Vanessa smiled faintly, a plan beginning to take shape in her mind. "One step at a time." The morning light brought a clarity to Vanessa Carter's thoughts that had eluded her since the plane's unexpected landing. Sitting with a steaming mug of coffee on Deborah's porch, Vanessa watched as the settlement slowly came to life. Children ran between homes, their laughter mingling with the sounds of tools clanking and conversations drifting on the wind. The community was vibrant in its resilience, even as its struggles remained evident in the weathered buildings and makeshift repairs. Vanessa felt a deep admiration for the people here, especially Deborah, whose steady strength anchored the group. Deborah reminded her of her grandmother in ways she couldn't ignore: a quiet but commanding presence, unyielding in the face of challenges. It was a trait Vanessa hadn't yet figured out how to embody herself. Deborah joined her on the porch, a second mug in hand. "You're up early," Deborah said, easing into the chair beside her. "Couldn't sleep," Vanessa admitted. She hesitated before continuing. "I've been thinking about everything you told me yesterday about the land, the corporations trying to take it, the way this place has been ignored." Deborah nodded slowly. "We've been fighting for years, but it's hard to make people care. They don't see us. To them, we're just another forgotten place." Vanessa stared out at the settlement, her jaw tightening. "That's not right. What you're doing here, holding this place together, it matters. People need to see that." Deborah gave her a wry smile. You sound like someone who's about to stir up some trouble. Vanessa laughed softly. Maybe, but it's the good kind of trouble. The word stayed with her as she helped Marcus and Carlos with repairs throughout the morning. Each nail hammered into place, and each board fitted reminded her of her own struggles or years as a nurse in underfunded hospitals, where every patient deserved care, but not all could afford it. She had fought hard to make a difference in her own small way, yet it never felt like enough. The more she immersed herself in the community's struggles, the more parallels she saw with her grandmother's story. Eleanor Carter had fought not only for her family, but for entire neighborhoods that had been abandoned by those in power. Vanessa wondered if this was her chance to carry on that legacy. As the sun reached its zenith, Vanessa found herself standing by the fence, gazing at the horizon where the dirt road disappeared into the woods. She thought of her journey to Seattle, the plan she had made to uncover her grandmother's history. But now, a new purpose seemed to tug at her, a responsibility to amplify the voices of the people she had met. Her thoughts were interrupted by Carlos, who jogged up, his curly hair bouncing as he grinned. You thinking of making a run for it? Vanessa shook her head with a smile. Not quite. Carlos leaned against the fence, his youthful energy undiminished despite the morning's work. You know, for someone who's just passing through, you fit in pretty well here. People like you. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? I've only been here a day. He shrugged. It's not about how long you've been here. It's about how you've shown up. People notice. The words lingered in Vanessa's mind long after Carlos left to rejoin Marcus. She wondered if he was right. Was she really making a difference, even in such a short time? Later that afternoon, Deborah called a meeting in the small community center. It was a humble building with mismatched chairs and a makeshift podium, but it buzzed with energy as residents filled the space. Vanessa joined Marcus, Carlos, and Deborah near the front, listening as people voiced their concerns. One woman spoke about the lack of reliable transportation, while another mentioned the creeping threat of a developer rumored to be eyeing the land. A young father worried about the state of the school his children attended, which had fewer resources each year. As the discussion went on, Vanessa felt her frustration growing. These were problems she had heard before, not just here, but everywhere, places where power and privilege ignored those without. She had always believed in small acts of kindness, but sitting here, she realized the scale of what was needed was far greater. When there was a pause, Deborah looked at Vanessa expectantly. You've been quiet, Deborah said. What do you think about all this? Vanessa hesitated. She didn't want to overstep, but her chest burned with a need to say something. Slowly, she stood, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her. I think what you're doing here is remarkable, Vanessa began, her voice steady. You've built a community with almost nothing, and you've kept it alive despite everything working against you. That takes strength most people can't imagine. She took a breath, glancing around the room. But I also think you shouldn't have to do it alone. People need to see what's happening here. They need to hear your stories, understand your struggles. Because if they don't, nothing will change. A murmur spread through the room. Some faces looked hopeful, others skeptical. A man near the back stood, his arms crossed. And how do you plan to make them see? We've tried for years, and no one's cared. Vanessa met his gaze. We try again, she said firmly. We make it impossible for them to ignore us. I've seen what happens when people come together to demand change. It's not easy and it's not fast, but it works. Deborah watched her closely, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. You've got a lot of fire, Vanessa. Maybe it's just what we need. After the meeting, Deborah pulled Vanessa aside. You've got ideas, Deborah said. Now's the time to act on them. Vanessa nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how she would balance her journey to Seattle with the fight for this community, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. That evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, Vanessa sat with Marcus and Carlos by a small fire. They shared stories and laughter, but beneath it all was a sense of urgency. Vanessa felt the weight of her words from the meeting pressing on her. She stared into the flames, thinking of her grandmother. Eleanor Carter had faced overwhelming odds, and she hadn't backed down. Vanessa would do the same. Tomorrow, she would start making calls. Tomorrow, she would begin to make people see. The morning dawned with a faint chill, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Vanessa Carter stood outside Deborah's home, watching as the community slowly came to life. There was a sense of routine here, people moving purposefully to mend fences, tend to small gardens, or carry out other tasks to sustain their settlement. It reminded Vanessa of the hospital shift she had once endured, where every hand was needed and every action mattered. She sipped the steaming cup of coffee Marcus had handed her earlier, feeling its warmth seep into her fingers. But her mind wasn't on the peaceful scene around her. Instead, it raced with plans. After her impassioned words at the community meeting the day before, she felt an urgency to act. Words alone wouldn't be enough. Deborah joined her on the porch, settling into a creaky wooden chair. "You look deep in thought," she said, her sharp eyes studying Vanessa. Vanessa smiled faintly. "I am. I meant what I said yesterday. People need to know what's happening here, and I think I might know how to start." Deborah raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Vanessa hesitated. "I have connections, people I've worked with, people who care about social justice. If I can get their attention, maybe we can amplify your voices. But I'll need help to gather the stories, the facts, everything they need to understand the stakes here." Deborah nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You've got ambition. I'll give you that. If you think you can make them listen, we'll back you up." Vanessa felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. I won't let you down." The two women spent the next few hours discussing Vanessa's ideas. Deborah helped identify key issues to highlight access to clean water, the threat of predatory developers, the need for reliable education for the children. By the time the conversation ended, Vanessa felt more determined than ever. Inside the settlement's modest community center, a group began to gather. Marcus and Carlos arrived first, followed by other residents, each curious about what Vanessa had to say. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as Vanessa stood at the front, a makeshift whiteboard behind her and a notebook in her hands. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice calm but steady. "I know I've only been here a short time, but I've seen enough to know this community is worth fighting for. Yesterday, I talked about making people see what's happening here. Today, I want to talk about how." She glanced around, noting the mix of expressions hopeful, skeptical, but all attentive. "We need to tell your stories. The ones people can't ignore. The struggles, yes, but also the resilience, the hope, the determination. We need to show that what's happening here is a reflection of what's happening in communities all across the country." A woman in the back raised her hand. "How do we even start? Most of us don't have connections or money to spread the word." Vanessa smiled. "We start with what we have, our voices. I'll help you write letters, make phone calls, and even reach out to media outlets. We document everything, the conditions here, the challenges, and the solutions you're fighting for. Once we've gathered enough, we take it to people who can amplify it." Marcus crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "And what if they still don't listen? We've been ignored for years." Vanessa met his gaze. "Then we make them listen. One voice at a time, one story at a time. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of Vanessa's words settling over the group. Then Deborah stood, her voice steady. "She's right. We've been holding this place together with spit and grit for decades. Maybe it's time we stopped waiting for someone to notice and started making them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Vanessa worked tirelessly with the residents, helping them organize their thoughts and put their experiences into words. She sat with Maria, a mother of two, as she recounted the challenges of sending her children to an underfunded school. She listened as Hector, an elderly farmer, spoke of the polluted water that had destroyed his crops. Carlos proved to be an invaluable ally, using his boundless energy to gather photographs and record video clips of the settlement. "A picture's worth 1,000 words," he said with a grin as he snapped a shot of the dilapidated school building. Meanwhile, Deborah and Marcus worked on compiling data years of correspondence with local officials, unanswered pleas for assistance, and records of land disputes with developers. Vanessa was struck by their meticulousness, a testament to the persistence that had kept the community afloat. As the stories piled up, Vanessa began reaching out to her network. She called former colleagues, emailed nonprofit organizations, and even contacted journalists she had met during her work as a nurse. Slowly but surely, people began to respond. One afternoon, Vanessa received a call from an old friend, Lauren, who now worked for a prominent social justice organization. "Vanessa, this sounds like a compelling story," Lauren said. "Send me everything you've got. If we can get traction, we might be able to bring some attention to this." Vanessa hung up, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She shared the news with Deborah and Marcus that evening over dinner, their faces lighting up with hope. "We're just getting started," Vanessa said. As the week wore on, Vanessa grew closer to the residents. She learned about their dreams, their sacrifices, and their unyielding determination to hold onto their home. In turn, they learned about her work as a nurse, her connection to Eleanor Carter, and her struggle to find her own place in the world. One night, as she sat by the fire with Deborah, Vanessa opened up about her grandmother. "I didn't know about her legacy until recently," she admitted. "She fought for so much, and I'm just now beginning to understand what that means for me." Deborah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe this is part of it, carrying her fight forward in your own way." Vanessa stared into the flames, the flickering light reflecting in her eyes. Maybe it is. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity. The challenges ahead were daunting, but she wasn't alone. She was part of something bigger now, a community, a movement, a fight for justice. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Vanessa felt a quiet confidence settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. The settlement buzzed with a newfound energy as Vanessa Carter's plans began to take shape. Over the past few days, the small community had transformed from a place burdened by hardship into a hive of determination. Deborah coordinated logistics with a quiet authority, while Marcus and Carlos worked with the younger residents to clean up and document their living conditions. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their laughter carrying a note of hope that had been missing before. Vanessa, meanwhile, immersed herself in coordinating with her contacts. Emails flew back and forth between her and Lauren, the social justice advocate who had taken an interest in their cause. Photographs, personal stories, and data were compiled into a comprehensive report that painted a vivid picture of the settlement's struggles and its potential. Lauren said she's pitching this to a few media outlets, Vanessa told Deborah one afternoon as they sat at the kitchen table. "If even one of them runs the story, it could make a huge difference." Deborah leaned back in her chair, her face thoughtful. "You've done a lot in a short time," she said. "But don't forget, people like us have been overlooked for a reason. You might rattle some cages, but that doesn't mean they'll listen." Vanessa nodded, understanding the weight behind Deborah's words. "They'll listen," she said, her tone resolute. "We'll make them listen." The first glimmer of success came later that evening. Vanessa's phone buzzed with an email notification as she stood outside with Carlos, reviewing the photos he had taken of the settlement. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the message. From Lauren A. Subject: Media Interest. "Vanessa, great news. A regional news station wants to run a piece on the settlement. They'll send a reporter and crew tomorrow morning. Let's make this count." Vanessa's breath caught, and she turned to Carlos, a smile breaking across her face. "We did it. The media's coming." Carlos's eyes widened, and he let out a loud cheer. "You're serious? This is huge." His enthusiasm quickly spread as word traveled through the settlement. By nightfall, nearly everyone knew about the upcoming visit. The atmosphere shifted into one of cautious excitement. The next morning, the settlement was a flurry of activity. Marcus and a group of men worked to tidy up the communal areas, while Deborah rallied a few women to prepare refreshments for the guests. Vanessa went over her notes, carefully planning how to present their case. She knew this was their chance to make an impression. The sound of tires crunching over gravel announced the arrival of the news crew. A white van pulled up near the edge of the settlement, and a group of people emerged, carrying cameras and microphones. At their head was a poised woman in a navy blazer, her expression professional but warm. "Vanessa Carter?" she asked as she approached. Vanessa extended her hand. "That's me. Thank you for coming." The reporter smiled. I'm Rebecca Scholl. I've been briefed on the basics, but I'd love to hear it from you. Can you walk me through what's happening here? Vanessa led Rebecca and her crew through the settlement, introducing her to residents who were willing to share their stories. Maria spoke tearfully about her children's struggles at the underfunded school. Hector showed the cameras the contaminated water supply that had ruined his crops. Carlos provided a collection of photographs, each capturing the harsh realities and the quiet strength of the community. By the time the crew wrapped up their interviews, the settlement felt different. For once, it wasn't invisible. Its struggles, its resilience, its people, all of it had been seen, acknowledged. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she turned to Vanessa. "Thank you for trusting us with this story," she said. "I promise we'll do it justice." The news segment aired 2 days later. Vanessa and the others gathered in the community center to watch, the old television set perched on a wobbly table. The room was silent as Rebecca's voice filled the space, narrating the story of the settlement with compassion and clarity. The camera panned across the worn homes, the crumbling fences, and the determined faces of the residents. Maria's words echoed through the room. "We're not asking for much, just a chance to live with dignity, to give our kids a future." By the time the segment ended, the room was thick with emotion. Deborah wiped a tear from her cheek, and Marcus patted Carlos on the back, his expression proud. "You did good," Deborah said quietly to Vanessa. Vanessa shook her head. "We did good." The impact of the story was immediate. Calls and emails began pouring in, offering donations, resources, and support. A nonprofit organization reached out, promising to help with infrastructure improvements. A local university expressed interest in sending volunteers to work on projects. But with the attention came challenges. Not everyone was supportive. Online comments on the news story ranged from praise to skepticism to outright hostility. "Why don't they just move if it's so bad?" One comment read. "This is just another sob story. There are people worse off." Vanessa's chest tightened as she read the comments, but Deborah's voice echoed in her mind. "People like us have been overlooked for a reason." She closed her laptop, pushing the negativity aside. They were making progress, and she wouldn't let anything derail them. The settlement began to transform, slowly but surely. Volunteers arrived to help repair homes and install a new water filtration system. A local business donated supplies for the school, giving the children a chance to learn in a safe, supportive environment. One evening, as Vanessa walked through the settlement, she noticed the changes: children playing in a newly cleared field, residents chatting over steaming cups of tea, a sense of hope lingering in the air. She found Deborah sitting on the porch, watching the activity with a quiet smile. "It's working," Vanessa said, joining her. Deborah nodded. "It is, but there's still a long way to go." Vanessa looked out at the settlement, her heart swelling with pride and determination. "Then we keep going, together." Deborah's smile widened. "You've got your grandmother's fire, Vanessa. She'd be proud." The words hit Vanessa like a wave, filling her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The settlement was buzzing with activity in the days following the news broadcast. Volunteers worked alongside the residents to rebuild fences, repair homes, and clear debris. A newly donated water filtration system was being installed, and for the first time in years, clean drinking water felt like more than a dream. The community's small school had received books and supplies, and the children now spent their days under the guidance of volunteer teachers. Vanessa Carter watched it all with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The changes were slow, but they were real, and they were lasting. Yet she knew there was still so much work to be done. The settlement was a symbol of resilience, but its success was fragile. The underlying issues of neglect and systemic inequality couldn't be fixed with a few repairs. As she walked through the settlement one crisp morning, Vanessa spotted Deborah standing near the edge of the newly mended fence. She was speaking with Marcus and Carlos, her sharp voice carrying just enough to catch Vanessa's attention. "Morning," Vanessa called, approaching the group. Deborah turned, her expression unreadable. "Morning. We were just talking about the developers. They've been sniffing around again." Vanessa frowned. "Here? Now?" Carlos nodded, his youthful face darkened by worry. Yeah, we saw a couple of suits walking the perimeter yesterday. They didn't say much, but you could tell they were scouting. Vanessa felt a familiar fire rise in her chest. Do they not see what's happening here? The progress we're making. They see it, Deborah said grimly. That's the problem. They see something worth taking. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression steely. We've dealt with this before. It's always the same promises of jobs and development, but it's just a way to push us out. Vanessa clenched her fists. The thought of these people losing their home after everything they'd endured was unthinkable. We won't let that happen, she said firmly. Deborah raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to stop them, Vanessa? Vanessa took a deep breath. By making this fight impossible to ignore. The attention we've gotten so far is just the beginning. If they try to come for this land, we'll have the world watching. That afternoon, Vanessa got to work. She called Lauren, the social justice advocate who had helped bring the news crew to the settlement. Developers? Lauren asked, her voice sharp with concern. Yes, Vanessa said. We've seen this before. They use legal loopholes and corporate influence to push communities like this out. I need your help to stop them. Lauren was quiet for a moment before replying. This is going to be a fight, Vanessa. But I'm with you. Let's mobilize. The two women spent the next few hours brainstorming. They planned to build a coalition of allies, other advocacy groups, local officials, and even celebrities who could amplify their cause. Vanessa also suggested reaching out to pro bono lawyers who specialized in land disputes. Back in the settlement, Vanessa gathered the residents for another meeting. The community center was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Vanessa stood at the front, facing the group. We've made incredible progress, she began, her voice steady. But there's a new challenge. Developers are eyeing this land again. We've seen what happens when they succeed. They take what they want and leave us with nothing. We can't let that happen here. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. What can we do? Maria asked, her voice tinged with fear. We fight, Vanessa said simply. We use every resource we have to push back. The world is already watching us. Now we need to make sure they see what's at stake. She outlined the plan she had discussed with Lauren, emphasizing the importance of solidarity and persistence. The residents listened intently, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to determination. Deborah spoke up. We've been fighting to survive for decades. If this is what it takes to protect what we've built, then I'm all in. Her words sparked a wave of support, and soon the room was buzzing with ideas and volunteers. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Vanessa worked tirelessly to rally support, sending emails, making phone calls, and organizing meetings. Her determination inspired the residents, who threw themselves into the fight with renewed vigor. The settlement became a hub of activity. Marcus and Carlos led teams to document the land's history and its importance to the community. Maria and other parents wrote heartfelt letters detailing their struggles and hopes for their children's futures. Meanwhile, Lauren delivered on her promise to mobilize allies. A coalition of nonprofits, lawyers, and public figures began to form, each lending their expertise and resources to the cause. One afternoon, as Vanessa was reviewing a draft of an open letter to local officials, Deborah walked in with a rare smile. You've got someone on the phone? Says he's a big fan of what we're doing here. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, but followed Deborah to the small office where the settlement's only phone was located. She picked up the receiver. This is Vanessa Carter. Vanessa, the voice on the other end said warmly. My name's Malcolm Reed. I'm an author and activist. I saw the news piece on your settlement, and I want to help. Vanessa's heart swelled. Malcolm Reed was a household name, known for his powerful writings on social justice. Thank you for reaching out, she said. We could use all the help we can get. Malcolm chuckled. I've got a platform and a lot of connections. Let's shine a spotlight on this fight. With Malcolm's support, the movement gained even more momentum. Articles about the settlement began appearing in national newspapers, and the story trended on social media. Donations poured in, and public pressure on local officials grew. For the first time, Vanessa felt like they had the upper hand. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Developers didn't back down easily, and the community would need to remain vigilant. One evening, Vanessa sat with Deborah on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. You've done something remarkable here. Deborah said quietly. I don't think we could have done this without you. Vanessa shook her head. This isn't just my fight. It's ours. Deborah smiled, her eyes glinting in the firelight. Your grandmother would be proud. Vanessa's chest tightened at the words. She thought of Eleanor Carter, a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. Vanessa hadn't known her personally, but she felt her presence now guiding her, inspiring her. I hope so, Vanessa said softly. As the night deepened, Vanessa allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would protect what mattered most. The movement had grown far beyond what Vanessa Carter had imagined when she first stepped off that plane and into the settlement. What began as a small effort to save a forgotten community had become a full-scale campaign, capturing the attention of people across the country. But with greater attention came greater challenges. Vanessa sat in Deborah's kitchen, her notebook open in front of her. Papers, notes, and folders were strewn across the table, a testament to the work they had been doing. Deborah sat across from her, sipping coffee and flipping through a stack of legal documents. We're making progress, Vanessa said, her voice steady but tired. The news coverage is helping. Donations are steady. But the developers aren't backing down. Deborah nodded, her expression grim. They're playing the long game. Their betting will wear out before they do. Vanessa leaned back, running a hand through her curls. They don't know us very well, do they? Deborah chuckled, the sound dry but genuine. No, they don't. That morning, Vanessa joined Marcus and Carlos at the edge of the settlement, where the fence had been reinforced. A group of volunteers was helping to install signs declaring the land a protected area under local preservation laws, a temporary victory won by the coalition's legal team. It's not permanent, Marcus said, driving a post into the ground. But it's a start. Vanessa nodded. We'll make it permanent. One step at a time. Carlos handed her a sign, his grin contagious. Hey, maybe one day this place will be a historical site. People will come here to learn about how we beat the odds. Vanessa smiled as she helped secure the sign. Maybe, but we got a lot of work to do before we get there. The developers, however, were not sitting idly by. That afternoon, Vanessa received a call from Lauren, her voice tight with urgency. They filed a countersuit, Lauren said, claiming the settlement is squatting on land they legally own. It's a scare tactic, but it could tie us up in court for months. Vanessa felt a wave of frustration, but forced herself to stay calm. What are our options? We're already preparing a response, Lauren assured her. But this is where it gets messy. They're hoping to drain our resources and our resolve. Vanessa clenched her fist. Then we'll just have to fight harder. This place isn't going anywhere. The next few weeks tested the settlement's resolve. The countersuit brought a flurry of legal activity, forcing Vanessa and the coalition to juggle public advocacy with court proceedings. The developers' lawyers were relentless, filing motion after motion in an attempt to delay progress. Despite the mounting pressure, Vanessa refused to falter. She worked late into the night, drafting letters, coordinating with lawyers, and rallying support. Deborah, Marcus, and Carlos stood by her side, their determination fueling her own. One evening, as Vanessa reviewed the latest court documents, Carlos walked into the community center carrying a small stack of envelopes. What's this? Vanessa asked, looking up. Letters, Carlos said, dropping them onto the table. From people who saw the news story. Most of them are offering support, but some are more personal. Vanessa opened one of the letters, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. It was from a woman in Georgia who had grown up in a community like the settlement. I see so much of my own childhood in your story, the letter read. Thank you for reminding the world that people like us matter. Don't give up. Vanessa felt her throat tighten as she read the words. She opened another letter, and then another, each one carrying messages of solidarity, gratitude, and hope. People are paying attention, Vanessa said softly. Carlos nodded. They are, and they believe in us. The letters reignited Vanessa's determination. She shared them with the residents, who found comfort and strength in the words of strangers who cared about their fight. Meanwhile, the coalition continued to grow. A group of artists created murals celebrating the settlement's resilience, turning the once plain walls of the community center into vibrant works of art. Musicians organized benefit concerts, raising money for legal fees and infrastructure projects. Even Malcolm Reed, the renowned author, visited the settlement to meet with the residents. His presence drew even more media attention, and his public endorsement of their cause brought new allies into the fold. The turning point came during a public hearing at the local courthouse. Vanessa, Deborah, Marcus, and a group of residents attended, joined by members of the coalition and media representatives. The developers' lawyers presented their arguments, emphasizing the supposed economic benefits of their plans. When it was Vanessa's turn to speak, she stood before the room with a calm but commanding presence. "This settlement isn't just a piece of land," she began, her voice steady. "It's a home, a community, and a testament to what people can achieve when they refuse to be forgotten." She spoke of the residents' resilience, the decades of neglect they had endured, and the progress they had made despite the odds. She described the settlement as a symbol of hope and a reminder that every community, no matter how small, deserves dignity and respect. The room fell silent as Vanessa concluded her speech. For a moment, she wondered if her words had landed. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder and more fervent. The days that followed brought good news. The developers, facing mounting public pressure and a strong legal challenge, agreed to negotiate. The settlement was granted protected status under local preservation laws, ensuring its survival. That evening, the community gathered to celebrate. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of food cooked over open fires. Vanessa stood with Deborah near the edge of the celebration, watching the residents dance and sing. "You did it," Deborah said, her voice tinged with pride. "We did it," Vanessa corrected. Deborah nodded, her eyes shining. "You know, you got a knack for this kind of thing. Maybe your grandmother passed more than her fire down to you." Vanessa smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years. Maybe, or maybe this is just the beginning. As the stars twinkled above and the settlement buzzed with life, Vanessa allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, not for the settlement, not for the countless communities like it, but tonight, they had won a victory worth celebrating. Tomorrow, they would continue the work. But tonight they danced. The morning after the celebration, the settlement was quiet, the air filled with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Vanessa Carter walked along the narrow paths between homes, her heart heavy with gratitude and resolve. The previous night's victory was still fresh in her mind, but she knew the fight was far from over. At the community center, Deborah and Marcus were already at work, organizing donations that had arrived earlier in the week. The once empty room was now bustling with supplies, building materials, educational resources, and boxes of clothing. It was a sight Vanessa couldn't have imagined when she first arrived. Deborah looked up as Vanessa entered, a rare smile breaking across her face. "You're up early," she said. Vanessa shrugged, returning the smile. "Too much to do to sleep in." Marcus chuckled. "That's the truth. Seems like every time we solve one problem, another one shows up." "That's progress," Vanessa said. "It means we're moving forward." As the day unfolded, Vanessa found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the plane ride that had started it all, the injustice she had faced, and the unexpected kindness that had changed the course of her life. What began as an unplanned stop had become something much bigger, a mission, a calling, and a connection to a legacy she was only beginning to understand. Later that afternoon, Vanessa joined Carlos at the school, where volunteers were painting the newly repaired walls in bright, cheerful colors. Children ran around the small playground, their laughter echoing through the air. Carlos handed Vanessa a brush, grinning. "Thought you might want to leave your mark," he said. Vanessa took the brush, dipping it into a pot of sky blue paint. She knelt by the base of the wall and carefully painted the words her grandmother had once written to her mother. "Stand tall, even in the face of injustice." Carlos leaned over to read the words, his expression thoughtful. "That's powerful," he said. "Did she really say that?" Vanessa nodded, her voice soft. "She lived it." As she stood back to admire the quote, Vanessa felt a deep sense of peace. This was more than a school, it was a place of hope, a space where dreams could take root. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress. The settlement's legal battles were resolved, with local officials granting it permanent protected status. The coalition continued to provide resources, ensuring that the community's growth was sustainable. But the greatest change wasn't in the buildings or the infrastructure, it was in the people. The residents, once hesitant to believe in the possibility of change, now stood taller, their voices louder and their spirits brighter. Vanessa spent her days working alongside them, repairing homes, planting gardens, and organizing educational programs. But as much as she loved the work, she knew her time in the settlement was drawing to a close. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vanessa sat with Deborah on the porch of her home. "You're leaving soon," Deborah said, her tone matter-of-fact. Vanessa nodded. "I think it's time. The settlement is in good hands now, and there are other places that need help." Deborah studied her for a long moment. "You've done a lot for us. More than you know. But you're right, there's a world out there that could use someone like you." Vanessa smiled, her chest tightening. "This place will always be a part of me." The next morning, the residents gathered to see Vanessa off. Maria and her children presented her with a small handmade quilt, its colorful patches stitched with messages of gratitude. Carlos handed her a bundle of photographs he had taken during her time in the settlement. "This way, you won't forget us," he said with a grin. "I couldn't if I tried," Vanessa replied, her voice thick with emotion. Deborah was the last to say goodbye. She pulled Vanessa into a tight embrace, her voice low. "You're a part of this place now. Don't be a stranger." "I won't," Vanessa promised. As she climbed into the car that would take her to the nearest city, Vanessa looked out at the settlement one last time. The faces of the people she had come to love blurred as tears filled her eyes. The drive back to the city was long, but Vanessa used the time to reflect. She thought about the lessons she had learned, the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the profound impact of kindness. She carried those lessons with her as she returned to her life in Chicago, determined to continue the work her grandmother had begun. Vanessa founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting underserved communities. Its mission was clear: to amplify voices, provide resources, and fight for justice. She named it after her grandmother, honoring the legacy that had inspired her journey. The work was challenging, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Vanessa traveled to towns and settlements across the country, meeting people whose stories mirrored those of Deborah, Marcus, and Maria. Each place she visited reminded her of the settlement, a small but mighty beacon of hope in a world that often overlooked the most vulnerable. Years later, Vanessa stood in front of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of young activists. She spoke about the power of perseverance, the importance of standing tall, and the transformative nature of kindness. As she concluded her speech, a young woman approached her, clutching a notebook. "Your story inspired me," the woman said. "How do you keep going when it feels like the world doesn't care?" Vanessa smiled, the weight of her experiences reflected in her eyes. Because every act of kindness, every fight for justice, creates a ripple. You may not always see the impact, but it's there. And it's worth it. The young woman nodded, her expression determined. As Vanessa left the stage, she thought of the settlement, of Deborah and Carlos and all the others who had shown her the true meaning of community. Their legacy lived on, not just in her work, but in the countless lives they had touched. Vanessa Carter had found her purpose, and she carried it with her, rooted in the past, thriving in the present, and hopeful for the future. Vanessa Carter's story is a testament to the power of resilience, community, and hope. What began as an unjust moment on a flight became the spark for a movement, one that transformed a forgotten settlement and inspired people across the nation to stand up for what's right. Her journey reminds us that even in the face of adversity, change is possible when we come together and refuse to be silenced. It's a story about finding purpose, carrying on a legacy, and discovering the extraordinary strength within ordinary people. If Vanessa's story moved you, consider how you can make a difference in your own community. Share this video with your friends to spark conversations about resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage, perseverance, and transformation. Together, we can amplify these voices and keep the fight for justice alive. Thank you for watching.